He has been in the wilderness for 40 years, not 40 days, 40 years. He was raised in the most powerful palace on earth, educated in military strategy, in Egyptian law, in the wisdom tradition that had outlasted every empire before it. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records that Egyptian sources credited Moses with genuine military genius, that he had led campaigns, that he was being groomed for a position of real authority. He had a future, and then he threw it away. One act of violence, one dead Egyptian, and he ran. He has been in the desert of Midian ever since, herding sheep for his father-in-law, 80 years old, the most overqualified shepherd in the ancient Near East. And the people he was born to help, the Israelites, 2 million of them enslaved in Egypt, are still there, still making bricks, still being beaten. Whatever Moses might have done for them in his own strength, he has already failed to do. And then a bush catches fire. That detail matters. The Sinai Peninsula is dry scrubland. Brush fires start easily. Moses has probably seen dozens of them, but this one does not go out. The branches are burning, but they are not being consumed. And something about the stillness of that impossible fire makes him stop and turn aside and look. And the moment he turns aside, the ground under his feet becomes holy. Take off your sandals. In the ancient Near East, removing sandals was an act of absolute submission before a superior. It was the posture of a servant, of a slave. Moses, the man who grew up in Pharaoh's palace, is standing barefoot on desert sand before a fire that will not go out. And then God speaks. And Moses asks a question that turns out to be one of the most important questions in the entire Bible. He says, "When I go to the people of Israel and they ask me, 'What is the name of the God who sent me?' What shall I say?" That is not a strange question. But you have to understand what a name meant in the ancient world to understand why it matters so much. A name was not a label. A name was a disclosure. It told you what something was, what it could do, how it behaved, what it was like under pressure. The Egyptians had dozens of names for their gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus. And every name told you what that god controlled and what you could expect from it. Names were not identification. They were revelation. So when Moses asked for the name of the God he is supposed to represent, he is really asking something much deeper. What kind of God are you? What are you actually like when everything falls apart? What can you do? And what won't you do? And how will I know the difference between you and every other power that claims to be in charge of this world? And God gives him an answer that has stopped scholars cold for 3,000 years. I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent me to you. We will come back to that answer, because by the time you understand what those 3 words meant to a nation of slaves in Egypt, you will never read your Bible the same way again. But first, we have to go back to the beginning, because before the burning bush, before Moses, before Egypt, before Abraham, there was a name, and it was spoken before there was anyone to hear it. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. That is the first sentence of the Bible. And the first name it gives us for God is the one in that sentence, Elohim. And if you look at it carefully in Hebrew, carefully enough to notice what every ancient Jewish reader would have noticed immediately, there is something strange about it. The suffix "im" in Hebrew indicates a plural. Cherub is one angel. Cherubim is many. Seraph is one burning creature. Seraphim is many. By that grammar, Elohim should mean gods, plural. But every single verb connected to it in Genesis 1 is singular. He created, not they created. He said, not they said. He saw that it was good. one subject, plural form, singular action. Hebrew scholars call this a plural of majesty, a word that carries more weight and fullness than any singular form could contain. A name that strains against the limits of singular language because the one it names is too layered, too rich, too internally complex to fit inside a single grammatical category. And the author of Genesis does not use this name once and move on. Elohim appears 35 times in the first chapter of the Bible, 35 times in 31 verses, before there is sky or sea or stars, before there's a single living creature, before there's any human being to need anything or name anything or worship anything. The author hammers this name like a drum beat. Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. Every act of creation attached to the same name. Every burst of light, every division of water, every living creature, all of it from the same source. The point is not repetition. The point is ownership. Before you need anything, before you can ask for anything, before the first crisis in your story has even been set up, this is who made everything. And if he made it, he has authority over all of it. The stars, the deep water, the thing you cannot name, the situation you cannot solve. All of it made by the same Elohim whose name opens the story. But Elohim is a God who makes things. And the people who would need him most urgently were not people who needed things made. They were people whose worlds had already been made and then broken. For that, a different name was needed. Genesis chapter 17. A man named Abram is 99 years old. His wife Sarai is 89. They have been waiting for the promised son, the son God told them would come, the son through whom nations would descend, for 24 years. 24 years of silence. 24 years of watching the calendar move in the wrong direction. 24 years of Sarai's body growing older and the promise growing more impossible with every passing season. And then God appears to Abram and introduces himself with a name Abram has never heard before. I am El Shaddai. That name. The translation most English Bibles reach for is God Almighty. And that is not wrong. But it loses something critical because the root of Shaddai is almost certainly Shad, the Hebrew word for breast, the image of a mother nursing a child, a source that gives life from within itself, a sufficiency that does not depend on external resources or favorable conditions, or the performance of the one being nourished. El Shaddai is not the name of a God who tops up your resources when they run low. It is the name of a God whose sufficiency comes from within himself and flows outward regardless of what the situation looks like from the outside. And God reveals this name to a man whose body is biologically finished, to a couple whose window has closed, into a situation where every human mechanism for solving the problem has already been exhausted. Here's what most people miss about this moment. God does not fix the biological problem first and then reveal the name. He gives the name into the depletion. He shows up in the empty room and says, I am the one whose sufficiency does not depend on what you have left. I am enough, not because your circumstances are about to improve, but because of what I am. 1 year later, Isaac is born, but the name came before the birth. The name always comes before the birth. Now we come to the name that stops me every time I reach it, not because it is the most theologically complex, because of who received it. Genesis chapter 16. And to understand what happens in this chapter, you have to understand who Hagar is, not as a character in a story you already know, but as a human being in a specific social position in a specific ancient world. Hagar is Egyptian. She is a slave. She belongs to Sarai as property, legally, completely, without qualification. She has no family nearby, no legal standing, no one with any power who is looking out for her. In the social architecture of the ancient Near East, she is close to the bottom of every hierarchy that exists. She is not a patriarch. She is not chosen. She is not the kind of person the ancient world would expect God to visit. Sarai, unable to conceive, has given Hagar to Abram as a secondary wife, a practice that was legally and culturally normal in that world, which does not make it any less painful for the people involved. Hagar conceives, and then the dynamic in the household shifts, and Sarai treats her harshly, and Hagar runs. She is alone in the wilderness, pregnant, beside a spring of water on the road to Shur, which is the road that leads back to Egypt, back to the only home she has ever known. She has no plan. There is no plan available to someone in her position. She cannot go forward. She cannot go back. She is simply sitting beside a spring in the wilderness with nowhere to be. And then an angel of the Lord finds her. Not finds her. The Hebrew verb is more precise than that. The angel encounters her. In the same way you would encounter something you were looking for, the angel knows her name. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She answers honestly. She has run away. That is all. She has no destination and no plan, and she is not pretending otherwise. The angel speaks to her, tells her to return, promises her a son, Ishmael, God hears, and a future so large she cannot contain it. And then Hagar does something that no one else does in quite this way in the entire Bible. She gives God a name. Not Moses, not Abraham, not one of the patriarchs. A pregnant Egyptian slave woman alone in the desert names the God who found her. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees. And then she adds, and these words have stayed with me, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. The Hebrew verb behind Roi is ra'ah, to see. But in the ancient world, seeing was not passive observation. When a person of power saw you, it meant they were taking you into account. It meant you were visible to them. It meant you mattered to them, enough to look at, enough to notice, enough to act on what they notice. Hagar has been used. She has been treated as a means to an end. She has been sent away. In every system of value her world recognizes, she does not register. And the first thing God says about himself to this woman, the name she pulls out of her encounter with him, is, I see you. Not, I see your situation. Not, I have assessed your problem. Not, I am aware of your circumstances. I see you. And Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher writing in the 1st century, a contemporary of Jesus, reflects on this passage and notes something the text does not say explicitly, but implies completely, that this is the only place in the entire Pentateuch where a human being gives God a name. Before the patriarchs, before Moses, before the covenant at Sinai, a slave woman in the wilderness names God first. The spring where this happened was called Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. It has a name. The encounter was remembered. The woman who was invisible to everyone else was visible enough to the God of the universe that the place where he found her got marked on the map. El Roi, the God who sees. And here's the thing this name does to every other name around it. Elohim tells you God made everything. El Shaddai tells you God is sufficient for the impossible. El Roi tells you God does not manage the cosmos from a distance. He sees individuals, specific ones, the ones no one else is looking at, the ones the world has decided do not matter enough to notice. If you have ever felt invisible, to the systems you live inside, to the people who have power over your circumstances, to history itself, this name was given to someone who felt exactly that. And it was given to her first, before any of the patriarchs, before the covenant, before any of the structures that would make someone worth noticing. God found Hagar before he found any of them. Now we return to the burning bush. Moses is standing barefoot in the desert, and God has just told him to go back to Egypt and lead 2 million enslaved people to freedom. And Moses has asked for the name of the God who is sending him. And God has said, I am who I am. Tell them, I am has sent you. In Hebrew, the word is Ehyeh, from the verb haya, to be, to exist. And the 4-letter name God gives himself, Yod, Ha, Vav, Ha, what scholars call the Tetragrammaton, what most English Bibles render as Lord in capital letters, comes from the same root. YHWH, the one who is, the one who was, the one who will be, not a being among other beings, not a power among other powers, existence itself, the ground of all being on which everything else rests. The Talmud records that by the time of Jesus, this name had become so sacred that most Jewish people would not speak it aloud. The high priest pronounced it once a year, alone in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and the people outside would prostrate themselves when they heard it. Philo of Alexandria, the 1st century philosopher, calls it the name which only those whose ears and lips are purified may hear and speak. That is how seriously this name was held. But here is what most people miss when they read God's answer to Moses. Moses was not asking a theological question. He was asking a political one. He was about to walk into Egypt and tell 2 million enslaved people that the God of their ancestors had sent him. And those people, born in slavery, raised in slavery, some of them having never known a day without the taskmaster's whip, had every reason to ask, which God? The Egyptians had dozens, and the Egyptian gods had not done anything for Israel in 400 years. I am is the answer to that specific despair. It means I am not like the Egyptian gods, tied to a domain, limited to a category, managing a portfolio of specific concerns. I am not the God of this river or that sun or that particular kind of death. I am the one who simply is, in every place, at every time, in every situation, without qualification or exception. There is no situation dark enough, no crisis specific enough, no kind of broken that falls outside the range of the one who simply is. And from that root, YHWH, the name that cannot be contained, God builds a family of names. Each one is YHWH combined with a Hebrew word that describes what he does in a specific moment of human need. And every single moment is a crisis. Yahweh Jireh. Genesis 22. Abraham is on the mountain with his son Isaac. The knife is raised. And at the last moment, an angel stops him. And Abraham turns and sees a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. He takes the ram and offers it instead of his son. And he names the mountain Yahweh Jireh. The Lord will provide. The word Jireh comes from Ra, the same root as El Roi, to see. But here it carries the sense of seeing ahead, of providing in advance, because you already saw what was needed before the moment of need arrived. The ram was in the thicket before Abraham reached the mountain. The provision was already in place before the crisis fully arrived. Pay attention to this, because that mountain has a future. The author of Genesis tells us it is Mount Moriah, the same mountain on which Solomon will later build the temple. The same mountain within the same city where centuries later another father will not stop the knife on behalf of his son. Yahweh Jireh was pointing forward to a moment Abraham could not see. The ram in the thicket was not the final provision. It was the preview. Yahweh Rapha, Exodus 15. 3 days into the wilderness after crossing the Red Sea, Israel cannot find clean water. They find a pool at a place called Marah, but the water is bitter and undrinkable. Moses cries out, and God shows him a piece of wood. He throws it into the water. The water becomes sweet. And God says, I am Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals. The Hebrew Rapha means to heal, to restore, to make whole. And the name is given not in a hospital, not after a long illness, not to someone with a medical problem. It is given at a bitter pool. God does not hand Israel a better map for avoiding the wilderness. He meets them at the bitter water inside it, and he makes it sweet. Yahweh Nissi, Exodus 17. Amalek attacks Israel in the wilderness. Joshua leads the army into battle below a hill. Moses stands on the hill with his arms raised, and when his arms are up, Israel prevails. When they drop from exhaustion, Amalek prevails. So Aaron and Hur hold Moses' arms up until sundown. Israel wins. Moses names the altar Yahweh Nissi. The Lord is my banner. Anis in Hebrew is a pole, a standard, the thing ancient armies rallied toward in battle. The rallying point that told you who you belonged to and where the fight was going. The battle was not won by Joshua's strategy or Moses' strength. It was won by two men holding up the arms of an exhausted leader while God fought. Yahweh Nissi is the God who fights your battles and asks humans to hold each other up while he does. Yahweh Shalom, Judges 6. Gideon is threshing wheat inside a wine press, not in a field where wheat is supposed to be threshed, in a pit dug for grapes because he is hiding from the Midianites. An angel appears and calls him a mighty warrior. Gideon's response is almost funny. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? He has doubts. He asks for signs. He is a farmer hiding in a hole. And before any of that has been resolved, before the army, before the fleece, before the 300 men with their jars and torches, God says, Shalom, peace. The Hebrew word does not mean the absence of conflict. It means completeness, nothing missing, nothing broken. God gives Gideon peace before Gideon has done anything to deserve it, before the victory, as the foundation for going through what comes next. And then Yahweh Roy, Psalms 23. David writes, the Lord is my shepherd. The word is Ra again, the same root we have now seen 3 times. El Roy, God sees. Yahweh Jireh, God sees ahead and provides. Yahweh Roy, God tends. A shepherd in the ancient world was not a romantic figure. He was someone who spent his life sleeping on the ground, chasing animals that wandered off, pulling them out of thorns, setting broken legs, and standing between the flock and anything that wanted to destroy it. David wrote this psalm. He knew what a shepherd was from the inside. He had killed a lion and a bear, protecting his father's flock before he ever faced Goliath. And when he looked at his own life, after battles and wilderness years and betrayal and exile and the worst thing he ever did, and tried to find the name that captured what God had been through all of it, he reached for this one. Not a word of power, a word of care. Ra'ah, 3 times. The same root, the God who sees, the God who sees ahead, the God who tends what he sees. One Hebrew verb, running through 3 different names, building a single portrait of a God who does not manage his creation from a distance. There are 2 more names before we cross into the New Testament, and both of them were given in the dark. Jeremiah chapter 23. The southern kingdom of Judah is in its final days. The kings have failed. The prophets have been lying to the people, telling them everything is fine, that God would never let Jerusalem fall, that the temple was a guarantee rather than a gift. The temple will be destroyed within a generation. The city will burn. And into that specific darkness, the darkness of a people about to lose everything they believed was permanent, Jeremiah announces a name that will not arrive in his lifetime. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. And this is the name by which he will be called, Yahweh Tsidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. The Hebrew tzedek means righteousness, but not the vague aspirational kind. It is a legal term. Tzedek is the verdict of a court. It means being declared correct, being acquitted, being found to be in right standing before the law, and the weight of this name is in the pronoun. Not, the king will be righteous. Not, he will help you become more righteous. The name is our righteousness. The righteous standing will not come from the people. It will not come from their effort or their obedience or their moral performance. It will be given. The king who comes will carry the righteousness of God himself and somehow transfer it to the people who belong to him. 700 years before Paul writes to the Romans, Jeremiah has already announced the doctrine that will become the hinge of the New Testament. A righteousness that is not your own, received, not earned, given, not achieved. Yahweh Tsidkenu, the Lord who is our right standing before God, not because of what we have done, but because of who he is. And then the last Old Testament name in this sequence, Ezekiel 48 verse 35, the final verse of the final chapter of the entire book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is writing from Babylon. He is in exile. He watched the glory of God, Kavod, YHWH, the visible weight of the divine presence, physically depart from the temple in chapter 10. He watched it leave, slowly in stages, as if reluctant to go. He watched Jerusalem fall. He watched everything that was supposed to be permanent become rubble. And throughout his book, he receives vision after vision of a rebuilt city, of restored people, a new temple, and the very last word of his entire prophetic ministry, the final name, the name that closes the book, is this, Yahweh Shammah. The Lord is there, Shammah from Sham, simply there, in that place. The Lord is there. Not, the Lord will visit. Not, the Lord will pass through on occasion. Not, the Lord will be available by appointment. The Lord is there. Permanent address in the middle of his people. Ezekiel writes that from exile, having watched God leave. The last word of a man who saw the departure is the name that announces the permanent return. Now, take a breath and look at what these names have built together. Elohim, the God who creates from nothing, who was there before everything and made everything. El Shaddai, the God who is sufficient when you are empty, whose resources flow from within himself. El Roy, the God who sees the one nobody else noticed, who found a slave woman in the wilderness and marked the place on the map. YHWH, the ground of being itself, the one who simply is without limit or end. Yahweh Jireh, who sees ahead and provides before you arrive at the need. Yahweh Rapha, who heals what has gone wrong, who makes the bitter water sweet. Yahweh Nissi, who fights your battles and asks humans to hold each other up while he does. Yahweh Shalom, who gives completeness before the victory, as the ground you stand on going into it. Yahweh Roy, who tends you like a shepherd, who knows every sheep by name. Yahweh Tsidkenu, who gives you a righteousness that is not your own. Yahweh Shammah, who moves impermanently and stays. Here is what every single one of these names has in common. Not one of them was revealed in a moment of comfort. Every name came out of a specific human emergency. Childless at 99, alone in the wilderness, pregnant and afraid, standing barefoot in a desert, watching a bush that would not burn out, a knife raised over a child, bitter water after 3 days of thirst, a battle already in progress, a man hiding in a hole, a king being hunted, a nation watching their city burn. Every name was pulled from a specific breaking point, which means the full collection of names is not a theology textbook. It is a testimony. It is God saying, across centuries and crises and every kind of human emergency, here is what I am like when everything falls apart. Now, we cross into the New Testament and everything changes and nothing changes. Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Before Jesus is born, an angel speaks to Joseph and quotes Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Emmanuel, with us God. Emmanuel is not a Hebrew compound of the divine name the way the Yahweh names are. It is a description, and it is the most radical description in the entire list, because every name we have traced has been building toward this one. El Roi sees from somewhere. Yahweh Jireh provides from outside the crisis. Yahweh Shammah is there in the rebuilt city of the future. But Emmanuel is something further. Not God who sees from a distance. Not God who provides from outside the situation. Not God who will be there when the exile is over. God with us, inside the situation, wearing skin, getting tired, bleeding. Emmanuel is every Old Testament name taken to its logical and, from a human perspective, impossible conclusion. If God is truly the ground of all being, if he truly sees and provides and heals and tends and stays, what does the ultimate expression of that look like? It looks like a baby in a feeding trough in Bethlehem during a Roman census that nobody asked for, in a province nobody important came from, to a family that could not find a room. Elohim in a manger, El Shaddai in a stable, El Roi with eyes that get tired and need sleep, and then John, the gospel that opens by going further back than Genesis. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek is logos, and John chooses this word with surgical precision. In Greek philosophy, the logos was the rational organizing principle behind the universe, the intelligence that held everything together, that made reality coherent rather than chaotic. In Jewish thought, the word of God was not merely speech, it was creative power. God spoke, and galaxies came into existence. God spoke, and dry bones became an army. John takes both and says, they are the same thing. And then he says the sentence that changes everything. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Greek word for dwelt is eskenosin, from skene, meaning tent or tabernacle. John's not using the word for a house or a palace or a permanent structure. He says, the Word of God pitched his tent among us, moved into the neighborhood, set up camp in the middle of human life. The same God whose presence filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, whose kavod, whose visible glory rested between the wings of the cherubim on the ark, has now built his tabernacle out of human flesh. And we have seen his glory, says John, full of grace and truth. Now the open loop from the burning bush resolves. Moses stood barefoot on desert sand and heard the name, I am. And for centuries, that name was so sacred that Israel's high priest would speak it only once a year, alone in the Holy of Holies. The name that meant existence itself, the ground of all being. And then in John chapter 8, the religious leaders in Jerusalem challenged Jesus about his age. And Jesus says 7 words that make them reach for stones. Before Abraham was I am, not I was, not I existed before Abraham, not I have been around since before the patriarch. Present tense, eternal tense, I am. The name Moses heard at the burning bush, spoken by a man standing in a temple courtyard in Jerusalem. The same name, the same God. And in John's gospel, Jesus says it 7 more times with a predicate attached. I am the bread of life. When Israel was starving in the wilderness, manna appeared on the ground every morning. Enough for the day, never enough permanently. Every morning they woke up hungry again. Jesus looks at the crowd that wants more bread and says, I am the provision that satisfies permanently, not a meal, a person. I am the light of the world. During the Feast of Tabernacles, 4 enormous golden lampstands were lit in the temple courts each night, a memorial of the pillar of fire that led Israel through the wilderness. El Elyon above every darkness. And Jesus stands in the glow of those lights and says, I am the thing those torches were pointing to. I am the good shepherd. Every person in that crowd knew Psalm 23. They had grown up with YHWH, the Lord who tends. And Jesus looks at them and says, that shepherd is me. But he adds something David could not say. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, not risks it, lays it down, walks into the wolf's mouth voluntarily on behalf of every sheep that ever wandered. YHWH, taken all the way to the cross. And then the book of Revelation. John is on Patmos, exiled, when the risen Jesus appears to him in glory. And the first thing Jesus says is, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last, the full range of existence from one end to the other. Nothing before him, nothing after him, nothing outside him. And if that sounds familiar, it is because you have heard it before. Isaiah 44, verse 6. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. That was YHWH speaking through Isaiah. And now Jesus, in the final book of the Bible, gives himself the same title. He is not merely fulfilling the Old Testament names. He is claiming them. He is the same God who spoke from the burning bush. He is the I am. 3 things to carry out of this. The first, every name in this list was given in the middle of someone's worst moment. Not one was revealed in comfort. Not one came from a theology classroom or a moment of abundance. Hagar in the wilderness. Abraham with the knife raised. Moses having already failed. Gideon hiding in a hole. Ezekiel watching the glory depart. Every name was pulled from a specific emergency, which means the collection of names is not a description of God's attributes in the abstract. It is a record of every time God showed up for someone who had nothing left and introduced himself with exactly the name that fit the moment. If you are in an emergency right now, the name for your specific moment is already in this list. If you are depleted, El Shaddai. If you feel invisible, El Roy. If you are carrying guilt you cannot put down, Yahweh Tsidkenu. If you are afraid that what comes next will take you somewhere God cannot follow, Emmanuel. God with us is not a Christmas sentiment. It is the final answer to every question raised by every other name on the list. The second, the names move in one direction, from cosmic to personal. From Elohim, 35 times in 31 verses, the God who makes everything, to Emmanuel, one baby in one stable in one night that history could not contain. The names do not stay at the level of the universe. They keep moving closer, closer, until God is not above the situation or near the situation or watching the situation, but in it, wearing our skin, carrying our grief, dying our death. There is no more distance left to cross. Emmanuel crossed it all. And the third, and this one I want you to sit with. The name Moses heard at the burning bush was I am. Present tense. Not I was, not I will be, not I have been, I am. And that tense is permanent. He does not age out of it. He does not leave it when the crisis passes. He does not speak it to one generation and grow silent for the next. The God who found Hagar at a spring in the wilderness is the same God who pitched his tent in Bethlehem. The God who provided a ram in a thicket is the same God who became the final provision. The God whose glory departed from the temple and whose last word through Ezekiel was Yahweh Shammah, the Lord is there, is the same God who walked into a garden tomb and walked back out. He is not a God who shows up and leaves. He is the one who simply is, in every place, at every time, in every situation. The bush was on fire, and it was not burning out. That has not changed.